by saying what I think Corbynism is, I guess, and what therefore is at threat of a coup potentially. So the Corbyn programme to me is left reformist, and fundamentally Corbynism's aim is legislative action by a Labour government backed by strong popular support and implemented by the state bureaucracy. Despite being reformist though, Corbynism is still a movement of class-oriented struggle without being reactionary, hence the focus on restructuring the economy to make education free or private rents controlled, but also to defend migrants, refugees and the most marginalised in society. Who are the Blairites? Next slide please. Well, Blair himself is actually making headlines today. This is an article from today. I'm not sure if he knows about this event and its title, but he has said that a Corbyn government would lead to dangerous times. How much more dangerous it could get than, say, the murder of millions of innocent civilians and making this country a target for terrorism for decades to come, I don't know. But interestingly, in the same interview, Blair was also asked about his views on a potential presidency of Donald Trump, which I'm sure we all agree is very dangerous and very scary. But Blair simply said, oh, well, I think the same as most people here. So it's clear that he sees his role at the moment as agitating against Corbyn and rallying his own bitter following, not to actually ward off any potential danger. Next one, please. Meanwhile, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, I did have the title here. It said, "Smile if you voted for airstrikes in Syria." But I think Sadiq Khan didn't, because he's an opportunist, so I took it out at the last minute. But the Blairites generally are doing quite well to pose themselves as reasonable before getting their guns out. It's as if they started by approaching Corbyn with an open mind, so that when they're later critical, it's seen as a significant falling out. For instance, when Corbyn won, Wes Streeting said, "I will support Jeremy, but if that clashes with what is best for Ilford North, I choose Ilford North every single time," Ilford North being his constituency. And I'm not sure if he had the constituents of Ilford North in mind last week when he urged students to root out the hard left leadership of my union, NUS, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt since he seems to give it to Jeremy. Wes also said at the time of his fellow Liz Kendall supporters that they had to take a long, hard look at why they lost the argument, which they so substantially did. But I don't think, and this is a good thing, I guess, for the Corbyn project, that the Blairites are really doing that. I include Sadiq Khan here, as I said, not because he is what we should understand as the classic Blairite. Under Ed Miliband's leadership, he was very much a loyalist. But while now he's Mayor of London, he's a very pro-business critic of Corbyn. And as I say, I think a very political opportunist. So hence, why he nominated Corbyn, he's now later undermining him. So for the sake of understanding the potential of a coup, I think Khan can be grouped amongst these. So what about the state? Next slide, please. Well, the reforms that Labour's leadership is proposing will obviously meet fierce resistance from the capitalist class and its state bureaucracy. This is part of the Daily Mail article that was featured during the Corbyn campaign that said, 2023, I think it was, what will Britain look like under Corbyn as Prime Minister, and obviously riots and whatnot. I think One Direction were forced out of the country as well. Not necessarily a bad thing. But partly because of the political content of the measures themselves, which would obviously hit the rich, but more so of the popular political impact of Corbynism, which would throw up powerful working class currents on the left, mobilise the Labour movement and throw the rich on the defensive. That's the idea anyway. I think the latter is really yet to manifest in a measurable way. But what about coup? The reality is, I think, that a slow coup attempt has been ongoing since Corbyn put himself forward. It just hasn't been successful yet. So while running in the leadership election, Corbyn faced media attack after media attack. His comments on Hamas, his views on intervention, his proposals for sexual harassment policy, even who he's had romantic relationships with in the past. The media are so obsessed with the idea of a coup becoming reality, but how likely is it to happen? I'm honestly not sure. A serious intervention, though, the Blairites are all too aware, could bolster Corbyn's support amongst the membership and the movement, backfiring in a way that moves opinion even more towards Corbyn and towards possibly deselections. I don't know if that's necessarily a risk we want to take, but I think that's potentially what could happen. And the attempts so far are actually getting a little boring from most people, I think. So the right will probably have to save something quite substantial to get anywhere with it. It seems as though they've actually learned from the failed coup attempt against Gordon Brown 6 years ago. Next slide, please. So this manoeuvring is far more sophisticated than that was, if totally transparent. They call for Corbyn to go at different stages. This is apparently what the media is calling the Australian strategy, where they mount a series of coups against the party leader in the way that the former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard was hounded from office. So there was going to be a coup after we lost the Syria vote, it didn't happen. When the anti-Semitism crisis hit, it didn't happen. And after we did disastrously at the elections early this month, which didn't happen. And at the time, the Telegraph reported that, quote, senior figures in the party are now so concerned about the row, referring to anti-Semitism, costing the party hundreds of seats at next week's local elections, that they are openly discussing the possibility of an attempted coup following the EU referendum, which still hasn't happened. So, but despite some people's efforts to actively undermine the party, and actually Labour MPs' efforts to undermine the party, Labour did do pretty well. Didn't lose the hundreds of seats that the Telegraph and others were spinning. In reality, Labour lost 18 council seats, mostly to UKIP, which I think is to really be expected at a time so close to the EU referendum when Labour is taking a pro-EU stance. And Labour also kept control of every council. So it seems as though, based on the predictions of seats lost, this post-EU referendum coup won't be happening either, but we'll see. It also goes on to say that as the crisis deepened on Friday, David Abrahams, who's a major party donor, called for Mr Corbyn to quit, saying Labour needs strong leadership. Well, I guess for one thing, major party donors should not be determining the future of this country's democracy. And to say Corbyn is not a strong leader is, in my opinion, absurd, given his historic victory and the way in which he's responded to tax credits and disability cuts, both forcing U-turns from the government. Next one, please. If only the rest of the PLP could learn to capitalise on that. What are the chances that these self-interested stunts are cutting through to the public? I think very slim. It's very much posturing, and here you can see how quickly Neil Coyle, who was an MP that I put loads of pressure on to nominate Corbyn, was to change his mind when he knew that he could grab a headline from it. Next one, please. So the media will gladly spin this the best way that they can. And we cannot underestimate, though, that the party machine, also the party bureaucracy, there were serious misgivings recently, to put it lightly, in the way that they dealt with the recent Young Labour elections. And we witnessed a huge purge of members over the summer, of course, and as well since then. So I don't expect they would show any mercy if there were to be another leadership election. They could try bureaucratically, and since technically, if a Labour challenge was mounted, Corbyn wouldn't automatically make it onto the ballot. So it's not exactly clear if he would get enough nominations from fellow MPs, since he struggled last time. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, are they building up their replacement? Is Dan Jarvis waiting in the wings of a fighter jet? Since January, apparently 2 businessmen have donated a significant amount of money to his office to support his work, and which many have claimed that this is funding the appointment of a political advisor, I don't know, which is obviously not something that's warranted to backbench MPs, and therefore going towards his profiling for a potential leadership bid. It does seem as though one of their tactics is building up their people. For instance, the Labour right have utilised their contacts in the media to build up the profile of several MPs, not just Jarvis, but people like Jess Phillips as well. And they also have used their trusted allies to do their dirty work for them. So while the likes of Jarvis will not attack the leadership, others will, leaving him kind of clean and electable should a challenge take place. I use the example here of Liz Kendall with a gun searching for enemy leftists. So how do we stop it? Next slide, please. I believe, obviously, through intensive action on the streets, through building membership and mobilisation in the labour movement, including industrial action, to divert the state, give confidence to Corbyn's leadership, and to weaken the government. The Labour Party as an organisation must be turned into a lever of popular political mobilisations, championing the causes of all sectors of the oppressed. Unless we democratise the party and open it up to new forces and ideas, we'll never be able to democratise the state. It's the student, anti-war, anti-austerity, all those popular movements that got Corbyn where he is, and partly through signing up as supporters of the party, now hundreds of thousands, but it will take more than just a vote to keep him there, and his politics there. It will take our actions and popularising those said movements, which chime so closely with Corbyn's politics, further still. We also do need to stop it being just about Corbyn. We need an entire Labour Party that is irreversibly socialist. We need hundreds of leaders, not just one. Some in the cabinet shouldn't be there, and those good MPs should be built up in the short term. People like Blair don't understand the popular movements, or how they can win, or how it can take decades of groundwork for them to finally gain electoral success. They don't understand the new politics. Blair recently said he was baffled by the rise of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, the fights they choose to have, I think, show just how little they understand it. I think actually the anti-Semitism crisis, it might have seemed big, but actually to the outside world and the public, I don't think it's cut through as much as it might feel like in the political bubble. And also like the McDonald's sponsorship row, which took over the PLP for a short amount of time, how they passionately defended the right of a global corporation that exploits its workers to influence Labour's democratic events, and how little support they got from Labour's members and the public. So the McStreetings, McJarvises and McBlairs can be pushed back, but we need to build our own ranks inside and outside the party. Thank you.
Very much for coming, everyone, and thanks to Shelley for that. I'm afraid I don't have any pictures, so I'm going to steal her last one and leave that up, if that's all right. So, yeah, on really similar themes, I want to stand back a little bit from the situation, given Shelley's outlined very, very accurately what is a kind of dramatic situation politically. I think the most dramatic situation in this country really since the 1970s in terms of the potential for the left, the potential for real transformation, and the potential for other things to happen that can lead to worse outcomes. From the minute he was elected to leader, the establishment sort of tried to frame the Corbyn leadership as something that was kind of outside what is acceptable in polite society, really, that he's an interloper, that he's illegitimate, unpatriotic, and generally, you know, not really acceptable in the great tradition of the British Parliament and the British political traditions. David Cameron tweeted the day after that he was elected, the Labour Party is now a threat to our national security, our economic security, and your family's security. So he's basically, you know, an affront to everything that is sacred in the tradition of the great sort of gradualness that is the stereotype of British politics. And various kind of different versions of this have been taken up by, I mean, not just politicians, but actually by the military, clearly by the media, and by other sections of the establishment. He won't press the nuclear button, he supports terrorists, and most recently, of course, as Shelley mentioned, that he and his team are kind of anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. And I think it's important to be clear that, and I thought Shelley put this very, very well, that this is partly designed, this whole operation is partly designed to damage Corbyn and Corbynism politically. But I think it's also, at the same time, aimed at creating the conditions for his removal before he gets as far as an election. Now, you know, both those outcomes in each particular case are okay from the point of view these people are doing it. But I think that they're definitely, their option number one, plan A, is to find a way, find a moment to get him out before he has the chance of winning an election. And that's really what they're working on as their kind of deep policy. Now, one of the things I think that has been quite shocking to people is not just the fact that inside the Labour Party there are people who oppose Jeremy Corbyn, that there are people who are trying to do him down and so on and so forth. Although that, you know, some of the extent to which they've gone has been shocking. But the extent to which they're so open and outspoken and confident about doing this, you know, the Dan Jarvises and Chuka Ramonas and, you know, Tristram Hunts and various other people, they are absolutely happy to brief the media quite openly that there is a plot, that we are looking at a coup. I mean, this is, you know, this is not regarded as being kind of particularly shocking, that a coup is obviously something the media is openly discussing as something that's, you know, apparently part of the sort of norm of politics all of a sudden. As recently as March, that these people were briefing the BBC about, again, as Shelley said, not just the fact that they were looking at a leadership challenge, but they were trying to find a way to make sure that he's not on the ballot paper, which, you know, by any definition of democracy, and especially given his mandate and the scale of the support for him in the Labour Party, is an absolute travesty of any kind of democratic process. So, you know, why this confidence, I think it's worth asking, and why this openness, and why is it so centre stage, and so on. I think, I mean, partly, obviously, it's an index of the extent to which the Labour Party in recent years has been pulled to the right by the toxic years of Blairism, and I think that's one important, and particularly in the PLP, obviously. But I also think there's two deeper things about it, and one is that these rebels, even though they're a very small minority in the Labour Party itself, and even within the PLP, the hardcore are presumably a minority, nevertheless, they have the support, A, of the Labour Party machinery, essentially. I mean, I can't prove that empirically myself, but I'm pretty sure that is the case, that, you know, they are sort of central to sources of the kind of long-term power in the Labour Party. And B, a connected point, and the more important, is they have the institutions of the state behind them. They have actually the media behind them. They have, you know, the civil service behind them. They have top people in the military. I'm not saying that all this is completely conspiratorial, but in terms of, you know, what the central institutions of the British state want, they are in the same. They are in the same place. They are in the same position, because these institutions are not neutral. They are organisations that, and I include the media in this actually, they're organisations that have been built up over many decades, and in some cases generations, whose aim is to defend the interests of the establishment, the capitalist elites in Britain, and to make sure that any threat to them is dealt with in preferably kind of ways which are sort of fairly discreet, but ultimately in ways that are definitely decisive. And I think, you know, it's interesting when people talk about the media at the moment. I mean, it's not just the case that the media is biased, it's actually parts of the media, and most obviously the BBC, have become organising centres for the Blairites, in my opinion. And the most obvious example of that is the kind of Stephen Doughty episode where you know, he was shadow business minister, I think, and he was actually, you know, invited onto the BBC to resign from the cabinet in January early this year after the reshuffle, and that was literally a plot organised, you know, as far as we know, by Laura Koonsberg, but definitely by members of the BBC. So you know, you can see that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the Blairites and the state that is operating in a quite serious and sinister way. And you know, I think it's worth bearing in mind that on both sides of this alliance, this is a serious operation. You know, both sides of it's not the case that the state is kind of manipulating the Blairites. I think on both sides they are very, very committed to their project. I don't think it's the case that, you know, I guess people agree with this, but it's worth spelling out that, you know, it's not the case these are kind of MPs or, in some cases, ministers who sort of happen to believe that Jeremy Corbyn is unelectable. I think it's, in fact, the case that the more successful he is, the more angry and wound up they get. And, you know, rather than applauding the election results, which were fairly good, really, by the standards that were being set, certainly by the media, back in May, these people spent the next 48 hours trying to downplay the results, trying to rubbish them, trying to find ways to prove how badly Labour did, even though they're in the Labour Party. Hello, you know, you'd think that when things go well, they try and make the most of it, but they didn't. And I think that tells you, you know, how deep-seated and how serious this project is. I mean, people use the term bitterites, which is good, and I like it, and I use it myself, but it's kind of slightly wrong in the sense that this is not about personal pique or some sense of, you know, oh, it's awful, we've lost control of the party, though obviously that there is an element of that, but this is much more deep-seated. This is a question of political disagreement, deep-seated political opposition to Jeremy Corbyn's project, the project of Team Corbyn, and all he and it represents. They are essentially, in my opinion, neoconservatives, both in terms of foreign policy and in terms of economic policy. That's how bad things got in the Labour Party recently, and they are going to fight to hold on to that position everywhere they can. So it's true that the election results went well. It's true also, actually, that the internal polling immediately after the election, which showed that Jeremy Corbyn's support has gone up in the Labour Party in the last in the last year, which is fantastic news. All that is good, and it has made it very difficult for them at the moment, I think, in the next few months, to mount a serious coup operation. But nevertheless, they're not going away. This isn't over. They're going to come back to this question. So I just wanted to go back a little bit and just do a bit of context in terms of Labour's history, because in some ways, history never repeats itself exactly, but in some ways, in the Labour Party, it was ever thus. Because Labour it's a contradictory organisation. On the one hand, it represents the aspirations and the anger and the concerns of working people across the country. On the other hand, it's also always shaped by the fact that it focuses on trying to change society through working with and within the institutions of the state, the establishment institutions I talked about. And this means that its key players always work, very, very closely with the bastions of power in the establishment, and by and large, for that reason, they accept the basic assumptions of the establishment. They accept the basic kind of economic paradigm, whatever it might be at any particular time. They accept the foreign policy views. They support the wars the British establishment is committed to, and so on and so forth. And this isn't new. I mean, this has always been in different ways. This has always been part of the picture. And it means that, contrary to what is the kind of common sense of the situation, the division between left and right in British politics doesn't go down the middle of Parliament. The line between left and right actually runs down the middle of the Labour Party, and not even the middle, to be honest, in the parliamentary terms. The line runs, quite a long way to one side of the Labour Party. In terms of the parliamentary party, and the higher up and the closer to power you get within the Labour Party, the more right-wing it tends to be, for the obvious reasons I've outlined. And it means that historically the right is almost always the dominant element within the Labour Party operation. And I haven't got time to go into lots of examples, but there's numerous examples in the history of the last 100 and whatever it is, 15 years, where left figures, seriously left figures, radical figures, have been marginalised, muzzled, or destroyed actually by the right in the party, and by actually this alliance between the state and the right in the party. I don't know if people know about Michael Foot, was a left-wing leader in the early 80s. He was basically, any chance he had of winning the election in 1983 was destroyed by a bunch of right-wing cabinet ministers breaking from Labour and forming a centrist party, which was entirely designed to destroy a left-wing leadership. More recently, going back to the 1970s, MI5 and the CBI worked with the Labour right to force Tony Benn out of his position as a cabinet minister, Secretary of State for Industry, forced him into a much more junior position because he'd moved to the left. And actually the whole Labour government of 74 to 70, until around about 76, was harassed because it was under pressure from below. It was a relatively left-wing operation, certainly early on. It was harassed by the media, by the state institution, actually sabotaged really by them. And on the subject of Tony Benn, there was another ferocious operation involving the security services and the media against him when he stood for the deputy leadership in 1981. And there's a whole tradition of this happening. So that's a kind of little bit of a background. I just wanted to talk, just to finish on just a few things about the current, about the Corbyn phenomenon and how it plays out in comparison with the history, because I think there's elements of continuity and elements of change. There almost always is. So that's a commonplace. But we have a leader. I think what's new about the situation, perhaps unprecedented. People can challenge that, but we have a leader now in the Labour Party who has really, in a sense, I mean, the establishment have got some justification for this. He has come from the outside in a certain sense. I mean, okay, he's a long-term Labour Party member, but in terms of being anywhere near the centres of power in Labour, he comes from the outside. He's been propelled into the centre, as Shelley was saying, by the support that he has gained over the years in the mass movements. The anti-austerity movement, the Palestine movement, the anti-war movement, these things, they are his base, actually, and they are the forces that have got him where he is. And sometimes, if you think about it, many of those movements have actually been movements that were generated against the Labour Party, which I think is probably a unique element of the situation. And what's certainly unusual, or what's an unusual coming together of circumstances, he is being propelled into the centre of the Labour Party at a time when, in its recent past, it has been in one of its most right-wing incarnations ever. So in a certain sense, you have a kind of collision taking place, a slow-motion collision taking place between this very right-wing, essentially neoconservative ex-leadership of the Labour Party, continuing leadership of the Labour Party, and this new leadership, aspiring leadership, that is coming from somewhere very different, actually from an opposing place, and that is playing out in slow motion, and sometimes it speeds up actually, but at the moment it's kind of taking a slightly slow moment. And this makes it a peculiarly volatile and tense political situation that I think is going to unfold in the next few months. So, just a couple of points about how I think we should think about responding to the situation, because there are essentially two scenarios, two different strategies that can be taken up in this situation, and they overlap in the sense of lots of people believe in both of them, and that's fine. But I'm just, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to say that they're two, and they are actually two discrete ways of approaching it. The first is to campaign in the constituencies, to deselect right-wing MPs, to campaign in annual conferences, to change policy, to support the Corbyn project, and to do all these kind of things, and to fight the long battle internally, really. And this is fine, and loads of people do it, and it's absolutely right that they should, and I'm sure everyone here supports that operation. But I want to just raise a couple of warnings about this as a strategy in itself. One is, it's a very, very long-term operation in a situation where I don't think we've necessarily got very long. We know, it's a weird political situation, but things change almost weekly. You can just feel in a very different place from one week to another at the moment. I think things are essentially moving, potentially can move very, very quickly. And this internal strategy takes place in structures that are historically weighted to benefit the right of the party. And actually removing an MP is deselecting an MP is a very, very long process that can involve going to the courts and all sorts of things that are very, very time consuming and involve you in kind of fighting on the terrain of the establishment. Certainly the establishment of the Labour Party, but also in certain circumstances the establishment of the state if you have to go to court. So that's my first warning. The second one is that any purely internal strategy, and this is a bit more general, any purely internal strategy carries the danger of actually being sucked into a kind of rightward drift politically, because it's not just the top tiers of the Labour Party that are challenged by the kind of rightward tendencies of the establishment and electoralism and so forth. These tendencies, to a lesser extent, but still quite potently, can affect anyone and any group of people inside the Labour Party. And actually, I think one of the things you can see right now happening, and it's interestingly symbolised today, in a way I'll explain, is that there's a kind of a soft left emerging in the Labour Party, which is, or not even necessarily in the Labour Party, but kind of around the Corbyn project, which is arguing that, we shouldn't really take on the Corbyn and the movement as a whole, shouldn't take on the difficult issues, should drop some of the things about foreign policy. Let's not oppose Trident, that's too hard. Let's not talk about Zionism, we'll get into trouble there. We need to sort of modify ourselves to be a bit Middle England, these kind of arguments. And those arguments are not just affecting MPs. There is, as I mentioned, what I was talking about was there's a big conference in central London today with Varoufakis, Owen Jones, John McDonnell, Caroline Lucas, arguing that we should stay in what I regard as a neoliberal Europe. We won't get into that now, they're talking about that downstairs. But many of those people have been arguing for a kind of new realism around Corbyn. Now, it's not like the old new realism, to get into sort of complexities, but nevertheless, it is an argument explicitly, don't talk too openly about socialist policies, let's modify. And this is a real danger. And it can be, one form the kind of coup can take is a gradual erosion of positions over time that lead to a situation where, okay, the establishment may end up thinking, well, we can't stop Corbyn becoming leader of the, even becoming Prime Minister, but at least we've destroyed the elements of the programme that was threatening to us. So that's another version of a very British coup that can take place. So that's my thoughts about strategy 1. Finally, just on strategy 2, the second, which Shelley mentioned, which is actually the left's main task, in my opinion, in the next few months and potentially years, is to build the movements on the ground out of which Corbyn arose, out of which the whole phenomenon arose. We need to learn the lessons of how we got a left-wing leader there in the first place. It came out of the struggles against the war, the struggles against austerity, the strikes, the general movement of working class people and other groups over the last decade and a half that have actually been historically significant. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the level of protest and demonstration and marching and direct action is higher now in Britain in the last few years than it has been at any time since the 1970s. And it seems to me that this is the essential thing that the left needs to focus on. Whatever we do in the Labour Party, this is the essential thing. This is the thing that promoted and propelled Jeremy to the position he's in. This is the thing that can batter the right. And one thing I want to say here, which is not often said, the Tories at the moment are extremely weak and vulnerable. I mean, I don't really like the idea that that anyone's talking about, well, we're going to get Jeremy elected in 2020. We cannot allow the Tories to stay until 2020. Our project must be to try and smash them, to try and get them out before then. And the only way we're going to do that is by building these movements. And I think, given how divided they are, they've been making retreat after retreat in the face of opposition. And so I think that's part of it. But also, the only way we're going to batter the right in the Labour Party and keep them back and contain them is, again, I believe, by building these movements and reinforcing these movements. I'll just end by saying two things about the mass movements and the protests and so forth. One is, time after time in the media, in academia, amongst writers and commentators, the role of popular opposition and popular mobilisation is written out of history in terms of any kind of analysis, in terms of any conceptualisation of how society runs and how society changes. But actually, if you think about it, over the last few decades, what are the things that even these very same media and academic people will say have been turning points in British society? And I reckon probably the three most important that people would talk about would be, one, the miners' strike in the 80s, which was obviously a turning point in a bad way. Two, the poll tax demonstrations and protest movements in the early 90s, which led to Thatcher going, and even the mainstream accept that. And three, the anti-war movement earlier last decade, which I think shaped the politics of the last decade and actually did for Blair in the end. So don't let people say that people power isn't defining and isn't crucial. It is, in my opinion, the fundamental. I mean, you can't be crude about these things, but fundamentally it is by these sorts of things that society changes. And I would say that a very, very important conclusion from this is not just that we need to build the movements, but we need to build a left that is focused on this question of the movements. And, because I think that the final danger that I see in the kind of strategy of being in the Labour Party and seeing the struggle in the Labour Party is the key thing, is that what happens in those circumstances, people get so bogged down in the internal politics, is they forget to face outwards. They forget to face towards the movements. They forget to think about the strategic questions of building opposition. All these big things that I've mentioned, the miners' strike, the poll tax, the anti-war movement, the truth is none of these were organised, none of these were mobilised initially by people in the Labour Party. They were all you know, the miners obviously organised the miners' strike. The poll tax demonstration was organised, was not, you know, obviously it took on a huge popular expression, but originally it was set up by people on the far left, and the Stop the War Coalition was set up by people on the left, mainly people outside of the Labour Party, and we need to learn that lesson. It seems to me that one of the things we have to do, we support the people fighting inside the Labour Party and do everything we can to work with them and to make sure that that process goes forward, but we also have to build not just the movements, but an extra parliamentary left that has the capacity to relate to millions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks again, Shelley. I mean, there's a lot there to respond to, so we're going to open it up now. If people have got any questions or contributions, if people would like to contribute, then please can they keep those contributions to no more than 3 minutes so we can get in as many people as we can. I'm seeing quite a few hands up here. Guy, right at the end there, please.
Yeah, Chris referenced the kind of the formation of the soft left. I think quite dangerous rhetoric from the likes of Owen Jones and Paul Mason in the last couple of months. And really what I'm trying to ask is, how can we challenge this kind of giving up of so much ground? How do we challenge that in a way that is kind of conducive to that? Secondly, neither Shelley or Chris mentioned momentum, which I think is probably worth talking about. I think probably has a key role in defending Jeremy. I'm a member of Momentum, and I know quite a lot of people that are. A few people that are members of Momentum, perhaps in the last couple of months, are going a little bit critical. Perhaps not critical, but kind of doubting the identity of Momentum and just saying, is Momentum an extension of Labour Party's policy, or is it an extension of Corbynism? Is it actually trying to enact Corbynism in most communities and fight for Corbynism, rather than just defending Labour Party policy, which may be influenced, or is influenced in some degree by compromise? So that's really just, what is the role of Momentum in all of this?
The sister down here.
Well, I agree with Chris that the movement helped build Corbyn today, but it was also a sign of a failure of a sectarian left. And when Corbyn came along, it energized people across the country in a way that nothing has. What we know about the PLP's history, so Corbyn was relying on the NEC and conference to help change the policy. But all these thousands and thousands of new members joined, very few are active in the Labour Party. So actually, NEC slate is looking extremely right-wing, and they're packing delegates in for conference, which is a really big worry. I don't think, if I look at my ward, we have 400 new members. We have hundreds of members. If we can get half of our members active, not just in the party, but in the movement, we will build a genuine movement. We've already got people who are politically engaged enough to think about joining the party and voting for Corbyn. And that's how I think we should have a model that every ward try to get 50% of the new members, who are mostly Corbynites, active. Not just going to party meetings, but going on the picket lines, UCU picket lines, doctors' picket lines, and setting up something outside, but also inside. So I don't think it's, the left tradition have always argued, and I have been part of it, that Labour Party is reformers, you can't do anything with it, they get involved in internal politics, but I think this is a certain time that if you're a revolutionary, you should look at the situation. It's engage people in a way that the left have failed, and the left are declining in many ways, but there's new movements coming out in the streets. There's new radical movements influenced by anarchism and all sorts of things. There's a lot of anger there. And it's channeling the anger and working collectively, inside and outside. But actually, I think there's a momentum, depends where you are. Some places have done incredibly well, other places they've been very destructive. So it varies. There's a not clear picture. And what I don't understand is that a lot of people didn't explain to new members how to
Can you
get
sum up,
involved.
please?
Anyway, sorry. So I think it's a bit more complicated than what's been said.
Simon.
I'm just thinking, do you think the establishment, that's the state and the Labour right, are more worried about Corbyn's social justice programme, such as opposing austerity and wanting to bring back a publicly owned post office and NHS and so on, or are they more worried about his anti-imperialist credentials? Because previous Labour governments have always had more leeway to be focusing on social justice domestically, like building the NHS in the first place. But obviously, the Labour government that gave us the NHS built the atomic bomb and generally followed an imperial agenda. So do you think it's Corbyn's anti-imperialist credentials that are really, really worrying them?
Guy up there at the penultimate row.
Me. Not really. My name's Tom. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in central London. I thought that was a really useful discussion, really. Particularly, I think it's absolutely right to see Corbynism as both an expression of and an intensifier of social movements which have been built in Britain for years and years. I suppose I want to try and deal with two things quickly, really. The first one is about why it is that the Labour Party seems to have drifted rightwards over the years, because I think that if you accept the idea that the way to deal with the excesses of capitalism is to simply reform the system, then when that system is in crisis, there are certain rules that are imposed on you. Why is it, for instance, that the Troika and so on dealt with Greece with such brutality? Not because Angela Merkel, Wolfgang Schäuble and so on are horrible people, although, don't get me wrong, they are, but I think because of the intense competition and the brutality of the competition that exists amongst capitalist states and so on, and that's why I think it's absolutely right to look at the question of the state as central to this discussion. And it's an important one because, of course, the question of how you get Corbyn elected is obviously followed by the question of how Corbyn can implement his policies, and I think that, you know, Corbyn will come up against similar difficulties. Why do we know this? Well, I think if you look at what happened in France, François Hollande was elected on a massive wave of excitement that things could change for ordinary people. But if you look at what's happening today, is attempting to implement a neoliberal warlord. That's not to say that Corbyn will do that. I don't think that's necessarily true, but it's to say that there are very real pressures on people when they come into power. You know, Tsipras is a serious anti-racist, but he's still deporting refugees in Greece today. And I suppose, just to kind of finish really, I think there's lessons to be learned from what's happening in both France and Greece, because people may have seen that there are millions of people across France on strike, oil refineries, nuclear refineries, trains and so on shut down, and they've managed to successfully bring the government, I think, to the brink of having to make a massive step backwards on the work law. What do we learn from these? One, that the facts of the difficulties with dealing with the question of the state and so on doesn't negate the fact that people can fight back, but also there are things we can learn about the relationship that we have with the media. 2 days ago, the CGT,
Could you wind up, please?
Yeah, I'm just going to finish on this story really. The CGT, the French Union Federation that's leading the strikes, said to all of the newspapers, print this letter that we have written about the dispute. Only one newspaper agreed to do it, Humanitarian. And in response, print workers across France refused to print every newspaper which didn't carry the letter written by the union leader. Now I think that shows the strength that organised workers have to fundamentally shape the political discussions that happen in society. And the lesson from France is that organising movements is absolutely crucial, but also organising at the base of society where people are working and so on has a profound effect when it comes to struggle in those places and so on.
Okay, I've detected a handful of questions so far, so I'm going to ask Shelley and Chris to come back and then we'll resume the wider discussion. Shelley?
Yeah, I'll just do it quickly because I think it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives. Yeah, I didn't mention momentum specifically. I guess for me, I think momentum has a potential to play a huge role, but only really if it's seen as like the bridge between the party and the movements. And obviously there's internal disagreements about what role it should play, whether it should be internally focused or not. Particularly for me, I think the opportunities for it to be working with the student movement and the Labour Party would be fantastic. And on that note, actually, I promise you a plug. Next Sunday, if you're young or a student, there is a conference in Manchester, Momentum Youth and Students, I think it's called. But yeah, certainly it has a potential. I just think it needs to be built up a lot more and to be reaching it outwards a lot more. In terms of new members, I think one of the big mistakes we've made so far is that, particularly in London anyway, that the hundreds of thousands of new members have joined have so far been told to get out and campaign for the Mayor of London election and campaign for Labour in Europe or whatever it's called. Which is fine. Obviously, we wanted to win the Mayor of London election, but actually, if you speak to those people about why they joined because they're excited about Corbyn's position on free education or on anti-austerity, on his opposition to war. So we need to engage them on that level, on those issues. And as you say, send them out to picket lines, send them on demonstrations, before we start sending them door knocking. Interesting question in terms of, is the establishment more scared of Corbyn's anti-imperialism or anti-austerity? I think the two are so intrinsically linked. Wars are so tied to capitalism, so I'm going to pop out and say both. I don't know. Chris?
I mean, on that, yeah, I mean, I agree with what Shelley's saying. Although I do think it is noticeable that the things that so far have been focused on in attempts to damage the project have on the whole been questions of foreign policy, funnily enough. I mean, you know, there was the whole business about, is Jeremy going to deal with the Stop War Coalition last December, which was absolute madness, that took off, which was one thing. But there's the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which is very, very tightly linked to foreign policy as well. There was the Trident question: will he push the button? And I do think, you know, don't underestimate the extent to which the British establishment is deeply. I mean, in a certain, they can move a little bit on questions of, you know, taxation and maybe spending a little bit less or a little bit more on the welfare state. On the question of NATO, on the question of the EU, as you see now, on the question of our right to go out and bomb foreign countries, these are non-negotiable. These are like central to the DNA of Britain PLC, and so, you know, I think those are very, very important to them. Just on the momentum thing, I mean, I think what Shelley said again is right. However, I don't think it's a surprise that people, when they go to momentum meetings, they're essentially told that the first thing they need to do is go out on the knocker, because, you know, we do have to remember that this is what the Labour Party is. That is what the institution is. It always has been, and in a certain sense, to a greater or lesser degree, but essentially it always will be. It's an electoral machine because it is a political party dedicated to the notion that you can change society through Westminster. And, you know, it'll always be that kind of organisation. And so it's virtually inevitable that even Momentum, which is trying to be a movement in a very virtuous way, but actually it is a Labour Party organisation, and it's essentially become that. Now, I think it's right to fight within Momentum for a better perspective, but I really think that reality is concrete, and the question as to whether or not it's possible within Momentum to say, go on this demonstration, join this movement, etc., will depend mainly on whether the movements are in a healthy state. And whether the movements are in a healthy state will not depend on momentum, because that's not fundamentally what it's for. So really, you know, in order to win and pull momentum back from being a purely electoral operation, the main thing is to make sure that the demonstration in Birmingham at the Tory Party conference has tens or hundreds of thousands of people on it, so that it becomes a pole of attraction to people, so that it becomes something that people can look towards and can be inspired by. And so again, it comes back to a slightly complicated and paradoxical argument, but that my view is that really, even when it comes to the question of defending Corbyn, not the only thing by any means, but the most important thing is what happens outside the Labour Party.
Thanks, Chris. The sister in the pajamas t-shirt.
Thank you. I've got stuff from Denmark and in Spain, and I saw how they organise, and they do get more youngsters and people involved on the streets. I agree that both are important. The Labour Party, internal workings, as well as outside activism, and getting people involved. I've been working on the doorsteps, and what I've come out is all the negative media, how they portray Corbyn and also their politics. It's on the doorsteps, and we need to get people engaged. We talked about foreign policy, and I think that's an area too, about migration and racism. The whole debate is on refugees rather than actually looking at the war and why the things behind the war and stuff like that. So that's our narrative. Momentum is important, but I think I've got lots of young people join our branch as well in the Labour Party. They're not taking part, but you can change it. I was there in my little Labour Party of 12 people, we've got 400 new members. So I managed to say that we want to have a debate, education debate on economics, and bring people in with alternative views, it opens out. We can do that, but if you're there, then you can change it. I don't know how the structures work in Labour Party, because I left Labour Party when Tony Blair joined, what was the leader. But if we know how it works, we can. At the moment, in September that's coming up, it's true that the right have got all the states in, and it's a real struggle for Corbyn and Corbynism to win. But if we get involved at the local level, as with momentum and other activism, like in Lewisham we've got the doctors' campaign, we've got the local people involved who are not part of the Labour Party, but we could then get into the thinking about what Corbyn can do for them. So we've got to be critical and also be clever how we use our time and efforts. So I'm saying we could do both. When I was
Could you wind up, please?
When I was in Spain, so the young people there, they had a different way of doing. They actually did allow them to speak. Transparency. They were going for direct action. We need to support that too. But also then focusing on their party. We don't change their party, although we know it's been hijacked by the right. We can change it, but it will take time. But with the pressure of that poll tax, we're starting outside and meant to change things. We can do the same thing with Labour Party as well.
Thank you. Kieran.
Something I was actually touched on in the previous meeting. I think it's quite important to learn from where coups have happened around the world in recent times. I mean, there have been a number of very significant coups against reforming governments recently, none of which have looked like, Chile in '73. Yes, the state overthrew, in each case, Thailand, Ukraine, Egypt, now Brazil, perhaps most shockingly now Brazil. Yes, the state overthrows it. It's not been the sort of, troops going in presidential palace, getting bombed sort of scenes that you saw in September the 11th, 1973. What you see is the state working in tandem with a mass movement that does not present itself as being right-wing particularly, or being counter-revolutionary. Indeed, in Egypt, famously, the mass movement on the streets actually claimed to be the continuation of the Egyptian revolution. And I think this is the element that those forces that oppose the Corbyn leadership currently lack in Britain. I don't think we've yet seen a mass mobilisation that would support the actions of an undemocratic state and undemocratic bureaucrats overthrowing popular democracy. I'd be interested to know what other people think that might look like when it starts to coalesce.
Thanks, Kieran. Richard.
I just want to add throw something else into the mix, because I really like the way that both Chris and Shelley delineated the pressures that are being brought to bear on Corbyn and Corbynism, and the contradictory nature of the Labour Party. But another reason for the contradictory nature of the Labour Party is that it doesn't just represent the aspirations of working people in an abstract kind of way. The Labour Party, uniquely in European social democracy, has come out of the trade union movement, out of the collective organisation of working people. Now, that is one of its strengths, but it's also one of its great weaknesses. There's no doubt about it. I mean, for example, Jeremy Corbyn only got on the ballot in the parliamentary leadership elections because of pressure from trade unions, in particular Unite, who told Andy Burnham, if you don't get Corbyn on that list, there's a severe danger of the General Conference of Unite breaking the link with the Labour Party. So it was a quid pro quo. At that time, Unite's leadership definitely wanted Andy Burnham to be the next leader. They were as shocked as everybody else by the way things turned out. However, they are strongly supporting Corbyn at the moment. Equally, there is no doubt about it, you see from Unison and you see from GMB, people that are consorting with anti-Corbyn elements because they're uncomfortable about this new shape of politics. So this throws something else into the mix. And it's because of that that I was so interested in what both Shelley and Chris said about the strengths of this new political movement in Britain. But it comes from the movements. Chris mentioned three: the Stop the War, the poll tax, and the miners' strike of 84 to 85. And I just want to throw this into the mix. The miners' strike of 85 was led by one of the leaders of the unofficial strike of the miners in the early 70s against the then Tory government, brought down the Tory government. an unofficial strike in the teeth of a right-wing government and a right-wing trade union leadership. And it was the self-activity of those miners and a very political clarity that they had that led to it sweeping the coalfields and drawing mass support from other workers. Go to 1984-85. The one crying gap in that strike, and the reason it went down, was the concentration of the newfound leaders of the NUN in brokering deals with the established leaders of the established organs, and not relying on the power that won in 74, not relying on, in other words, the rank and file. Now, Corbyn's strength and his defence lies at the moment in ordinary people being motivated by what he is saying. It's not that they are looking for somebody to do it for them, but they're excited to hear the ideas being put forward. There will come pressures. It's not a coincidence. Unite is great when it comes to stop the war. It's great on Palestine. When it comes to Trident, it's fudge, 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 because we've got 10,000 members tied up in the nuclear bomb industry. It's not a coincidence that Corbyn, despite his clear commitment prior to election to ending Trident, is under massive pressure from the trade union movement. Don't take too clear a position. This could split it apart. So we have three things to do. And I'm going to end now, Mark. The first is we have to be aware, anybody in trade unions has to be aware that there will come a point, both in our domestic conflicts industrially and politically in the Labour Party, where we will have to face up to the established leaderships and say we are going to act independently when we have to. Secondly, we need to realise that if we're not politically clear, and this is where Chris came down to on the social movements, you need to have political clarity in what your strategy is, what your objectives are, and that's the reason, for example, why I joined Counterfire. A tiny little group that had the idea you could build an anti-austerity...
Sum up, please, Richard.
I'll leave it at that. I think I've put the...
Okay, the brother in the check shirt, please.
You're right. Yeah, quite a few things I was going to raise were just covered by the comrade there, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of attention given to like how far to the right the PLP are to Jeremy Corbyn, but I was going to mention, yeah, a significant chunk of the trade union leadership is as well, but you also have a contradictory situation where in my union in Unison there were 3 general secretary candidates all trying to outdo each other to show like what great mates they were with Jeremy Corbyn. And it was bizarre because 2 of them were bureaucrats who helped sell out the strike waves in 2011. And there's actually, I don't think that there's necessarily the level of organisational coherence politically on the left of the trade unions to be able to mount a challenge to the existing bureaucracy, and that's something that socialists need to think long and hard about. Another couple of quick things. Yeah, I mean the moves towards what seemed to be like from McDonnell and Corbyn about going to the social movements to try and work through policy seem to have stalled. And the sort of like policy consulting is something that's happening in a more traditional Labour Party way of like consultative groups rather than opening out. And I had really high hopes that, for example, like because I used to work in mental health, that developing a Labour Party mental health policy would involve going to all of the dozens, if not hundreds, of service user groups, campaigns, anti-austerity groups, convening conferences and meetings about how to build like a grassroots mental health policy, and that impetus seems to have stalled completely. The third thing I'd say is, how do we develop participation, both in the movements and in the social movements and in supporting the Labour Party? Because yeah, momentum is a very mixed bag. Like for example, near me, it's odd in that there's a particular like small and esoteric Trotskyist group who have kind of like colonised it, which can make for a very odd experience. And although it still has like enormous meetings that are really interesting, and it definitely plays a role locally, it's not building participation in a way that I think we'll need to win the next election. We've got to engage like the...
Can you sum up, please?
Yeah, the mass of the working class, and I really don't think that Corbyn or anyone's even in the social movements is successfully doing this yet.
Thanks. Tom.
Hello, yeah, my name's Tom. I'm National Organiser for the People's Assembly Against Austerity. I just want to hone in something that Chris said about 2020 being too late. I think it's really vital that everyone in this room understands that's not just polemic, that we are not a timid working class. That suits the establishment, it suits the right of the Labour Party. We need to be the kind of activists, people in the movement, people willing to go out on the street, onto pickets, on demos and supporting BMA workers or whatever else it is, with boldness and real strength and determination and courage. I think 2020 too late is a perfect little tiny phrase to really keep alive in our minds. You know, I'm tired of the sort of you know, timidity about all that kind of thing. So I think, as I say, that isn't polemic. I think let's really focus in on that and let's do stuff. Let's build the campaign outside the Labour Party. So inevitably, I'm going to plug two things that we're doing. The first thing is the convoy to Calais, but that does tie directly into this. Corbyn went to Calais. Cameron didn't go to Calais. Cameron made snide, let's be honest, racist jokes about the bunch of migrants in Calais. So getting behind refugees and showing solidarity with them ties into this project about supporting Corbyn absolutely as well. We have to do that in a big way. Please come along to that on the 18th of June. Please donate downstairs to Sainsbury's over the road. Look at the donation that's run over the shop and buy some kidney beans, whatever it is. And then lastly, as Chris already mentioned, we're going to be doing another mass demonstration in Birmingham around the Tory Party conference. Now, you know, there's always a little bit of criticism about what A-to-B marches achieve. You know, I think anyone who organises them thinks that after an A-to-B march the next day, Cameron wakes up and goes, oh yeah, sorry about that, yeah, I was going a bit mad there, yeah. You know, but they are vital tools in building a mass movement. We're playing a game with boldness and strength and courage that doesn't win overnight, but can win before 2020.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about some of the opportunities in terms of what Corbyn's brought. I mean, I think he's brought a renewed interest in socialist politics. One of the most Googled words this year has been socialism or socialist, and I think that's quite exciting. I mean, what brought it home to me as well, actually, how strange the situation is in a way, is when I was on a protest for fast food rights and for Primark cleaner workers. We were blocking the road, and I turned around, John McDonnell's blocking the road with us. I just thought, he's the shadow chancellor of, like, you know, the main opposition party in the road as well. So I think, you know, things have changed quite dramatically. But it does raise the question quite concretely about the state and whether the state can be changed. And I think I'd echo what Chris said about the undemocratic elements of the state. You know, the top military, top civil service and so on, top police are all not elected bodies. When you throw into that, obviously the bosses of corporations are not elected and no one's really in charge of the system. When you throw all that together, I don't think we get fundamental change through the state. But lastly, I'd like to say as well that, you know, there is the question of whether you join Labour or not. There's a tactical question. You know, do revolutionaries need to join Labour to relate to Corbynism? And I think the point is that you'll find a Corbynist more likely on a refugee demo on a junior doctor's picket line actually than a Labour Party branch meeting. I think that's the reality, so I don't think it is necessary to join Labour. And lastly, I think there's an anti-capitalist group in Catalonia called Coup. They have like a slogan, and I think it's the correct orientation, which they say, we have 1 foot in Parliament and 1,000 feet on the street.
I think that's been an excellent discussion. Kate's going to be our last contributor before I ask Shelley and Chris to sum up. So, Kate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to come back on a comment that was made in the discussion, and maybe a throwaway comment, but I think it's important to kind of understand the relationship was sort of about, yes, build the movements, but workers potentially have the power to stop society. And I think, yes, of course, potentially, but how do we turn that potential into something real? And I think it's very important that we understand the relationship between those two things and don't counterpose them. And I think particularly if you look at what's happening at the moment, I think it's impossible to envisage the doctors' strike and the action that the nurses have been taking, which has been inspirational and brilliant and is very important. I think it's impossible to imagine that without the hospital campaigns to save the hospitals that happened and took place on the street, without the big demonstrations that brought people together, for this reason, that in 2010 when the crash happened, most people accepted, and every opinion poll showed it, that there had to be some kind of cuts, there had to be some austerity, some cuts anywhere. It's impossible to imagine those strikes, which are strikes that are fundamentally taking up the question of whether austerity needs to happen, whether there need to be cuts to our health services and our public services in general, without that political argument having been won. And now the opinion polls show that that argument has been won. And I think that's incredibly important that we understand that relationship about how to take things forward. It's not about these things are two different things, but one feeds into the other. And I think what's also important about that is it means that we approach this as activists, as people that can change history, that we're not waiting for somebody else to go and take the action that we would very much like to see, but that we're part of creating it in the here and now. And I think that's very much in the spirit of Tom's contribution, and it's not waiting for 2020. It's the same argument about not waiting for the parliamentary process. It's about doing things outside of the parliament and realising our collective power.
Thanks, Kate. Shelley, would you like to come back?
Yeah, I just want to go back to that question at the start about anti-austerity versus anti-imperialism. I do agree with Chris, actually. I think the soft left that you talked about has conceded quite a lot on anti-austerity questions, especially if you look at the Scottish Labour Party's campaign and the way how they talked about fighting cuts. So yeah, I think you're right. I totally agree on trying to bring down the government before 2020, and I think actually after the last election, thousands of people took to the streets in the days and weeks afterwards, and that kind of dissipated quite a lot. I don't really know what happened. I guess maybe Corbyn's victory was actually part of that, but we do need to get back into that mindset, and so I think yeah, building participation, and actually the comrade who's wearing the Podemos t-shirt, you talked about your experiences in Spain. I know that Podemos have got kind of social centres and organising centres in every neighbourhood in some of the big cities, which is definitely something that we should draw inspiration from. That is a kind of Labour Party that I want to see, that brings people into those spaces, that talks to them about local disputes and campaigns and pushes them out rather than just pushes them onto the doorstep. And Kate, just quickly, you mentioned the nurses, so I need to call out next Saturday, 4th of June, demonstration to defend NHS bursaries that student nurses and midwives and other NHS students are leading. Please be there, and please look for the other demonstrations to come, especially Birmingham outside Tory Party Conference.
Chris?
Okay, I'm going to stand up, sorry. Two things, two basic points. One is just on the interpretation of Corbynism up to now. Because one of the paradoxes of the situation that we've been discussing is that this phenomenon of Corbynism and Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party is a kind of example, it's a proof of what I regard as being a kind of eternal truth of social theory, which is that essentially, not in a simple way, but essentially, change comes from below in society. Change comes through popular struggles. And, even Corbyn, at the top of the Labour Party, is, as we've said over and over again, a product of movements that have been outside of the Parliament. It's not an internal Labour Party phenomenon, and this is proved by the fact that he's got there just at the time, or just after the time, when the Labour Party was at its most right-wing that anyone can remember. There's no other explanation of that than to talk in terms of a kind of upsurge, not just in terms of the movements, but a kind of radicalisation, a popular radicalisation that has essentially been driven from below. At a time when all the media and all the politicians and the pundits have been saying that socialism is finished, we have the end of history, all of these things have been happening at the top of society, but actually that has been overturned by deep subterranean and movement forces. And I think, we have to hold on to that truth, because otherwise we won't have anything to guide us and we'll go in the wrong direction. And I have to say that the things Shelley just mentioned about, there is this possibility that the kind of achievement of leadership of the Labour Party can lead to people saying, okay, we've cracked it, Labour's changed, we're going to get in 2020, everything's going to be okay, I'll go back to watching TV, or talking about the PM, how well Jeremy did at PMQs this week as opposed to last week, and basically becoming a spectator sport again. And I tell you what, that will be an absolute disaster, and it's already the case, and I know this from Stop the War stuff, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but it is actually a truth. It's harder now to get MPs on the Labour left to come and speak at movement events than it was before Corbyn got elected. That's the truth. And the reason for that is not, I'm not name calling or anything, but the reason for that is the pressures of electoralism are coming into play. I don't know if we should go. I'll have to discuss that with the NEC, or I'll have to discuss that with the office about whether I can come to a Stop the War thing. You know, those pressures are absolutely immense, and we need to think about how best to overcome them. And it seems to me that, and the person who left, unfortunately, just said that, you know, there's less discussion with social movements than he thought would have been good. And again, you know, how do we deal with that situation? Well, you can try phoning up the office, or, you know, doing what you can within the internal politics. But the really most effective way to get the leadership to take the social movement seriously is to make the social movement so powerful and so strong that they cannot be ignored. And to me, that's the only guarantee we have. And, you know, Jeremy himself and the people immediately around him have the best instincts in these questions. But even they're going to have something to relate to. They're going to have something putting pressure on them. And unless they do, there's no amount of lobbying that's going to make any difference. Point one. Point two, final point, is about coups, actually, because it's very interesting. I mean, it'd be good to have a longer discussion about this, because there is this new phenomenon of kind of semi-superficially democratic coups, like the one that took place in Greece, really. Because although Syriza is in office, you know, in a certain sense, Syriza isn't in office, or certainly not the Syriza anyone really took any notice of back in the day. Syriza was kind of transformed by a semi-soft coup that was actually unfolded, operated by the EU and the international financial institutions and so forth. In Brazil at the moment, again, we have this kind of semi-internal coup, which is semi-constitutional, but obviously is part of the deep state's operation. Now, you think about both of those things, you know, very complex manoeuvres and campaigns and projects mounted by the establishment. In both those cases, one in a negative and one maybe not in a negative case, what happens on the streets and what happens in the factories and in the universities is going to be the decisive factor. And actually, you know, Dilma Rousseff was effectively, everyone thought she was history last week or the week before. Now you can see the commentators saying, maybe things are changing. The reason? Because there are hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets. There are workers talking about taking strike action. The university students are occupying the universities. And suddenly this coup from above, this internal coup, doesn't look quite as effective as maybe people thought. But there was no way, and sorry, in the Syriza case, you know, similar things happened. But actually the left didn't manage to mount what is being mounted, at least at the moment, in Brazil. And you talk to people on the left of Syriza now, and they will say to you, mea culpa. They will say to you, we made a mistake. We took our eye off the street. We took our eye off the communities. We took our eye off the trade unions, because we got sucked into this process where we thought, even us, even the radicals, even the Marxists, we suddenly thought maybe change can come through the institutions from above. And you know, that is seems to me, they both seem to be in different ways very, very important lessons. And okay, I'm in counterfire. I would say this, but I think that you know, this analysis of the way things work, this analysis of the way society changes, does predicate not just having an eye on the movements and going on a demonstration every month or 3 months or whatever it might be, but it does actually mean you have to be effective, a network of socialists that is independent from the electoral process, that is independent from the Labour Party, that is outside of the structures that exert so much pressure on people to conform and to moderate and to compromise. And I think, imagine if we were faced with a situation, which I believe actually in some form or another we would be faced with if Jeremy did win an election, where there was some sort of operation to either destabilise, defeat or somehow subvert a Labour government. If you didn't have a network of organised militants in all the communities, in all the workplaces, that had an orientation absolutely on the importance of struggle from below, then I don't believe you'd be able to deal with the situation. I think it would be impossible to actually mount a serious defence. And the people who are organising the demonstrations, many of them in Brazil at the moment, and the strikes and the occupations, they are not members of Dilma Rousseff's party. They are not members of the PT organisation. Some of them are, but the main ones, they are people who've been outside, that have been supportive, to different degrees. Actually, many of them have been very critical of Dilma Rousseff. They have now said what happens on the street is crucial and we are going to organise. And I think we need to bear that history and those events in mind when we think about how to go forward now.
Thanks, Chris. I've just got 2 announcements. The next meeting in here will be at 2:15, and it's Chris Banbury on Ireland. That'll be